Well, hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to another session of our Sunday morning Bible study. And we're going through the first three chapters of the book of Revelation right now, doing a series on those after having completed our discussion of end time events and going through the other part of the book of Revelation on that. So thus far, we've discussed up to and including Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. And in that section of verses, we have John saying that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day on the Isle of Patmos. And we talked about that, so we're not going to reiterate it all, but just kind of review a little bit and get us going here this time. And he heard a voice behind him that sounded like a trumpet. And when sound was a voice told him to write what he was going to see in a vision and send it to the seven churches of Asia. And we talked about Asia and Patmos last week. And so now we're ready to move on to the next section in chapter 1, which is chapter 1, verses 12 through 16. And so I'm going to read that section of scripture here for us, and you can follow along in your translation, or you can just listen to me here. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, or the son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it had been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. So, what do we have here? Well, he saw 7 golden lampstands, and that is like in the Old Testament, where in the tabernacle and when they built the temple, they had the 7 golden lampstands. And then he said he saw one like a son of man, or like the son of man. Now, the question we need to be sure we know the answer to here is, who is this person? Some, I think, have suggested it might be an angel, but in later verses we know for sure that's not the case. This is none other than Jesus Christ. Look how he's described here in verses 13 through. Look how he's described here in verses 13 through 16. He's described. The description is definitely of a divine person. Hair and head and hair like white like wool. He's got a royal robe on. His eyes are like a flame of fire. His feet are like bronze in a furnace. A voice of many waters. So let's look at this a little further. Son of man. This is actually the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, and Psalms chapter 2, verse 7 through 9. So we need to turn to those verses and look at those for just a moment, because it's very important. Because, like I say, what we're going to see in the rest of the book of Revelation that we went through talking about the end time events is the fulfillment of things that were prophesied in the Old Testament. in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Was in the first vision that Daniel himself had after he had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the image. And he says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days. Now, there we know Son of Man is none other than the Messiah, is the way they would understand it in the Old Testament. Came up to the Ancient of Days, who's God the Father, and was presented before him, that is, the Ancient of Days. And to him, that is, Messiah, was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion his dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And that's exactly what we see established when we get to the end of the book of Revelation. And also I want to look at Psalms 2, verses 7 through 9, where it is prophesied in the Psalms. Psalms 2, 7 through 9. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance. Give you the nations as your inheritance. That's exactly what we see in the end of the book of Revelation. And the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and shall scatter them like earthenware. Now that's talking about Jesus coming at the end of the Great Tribulation and establishing his millennial kingdom. This Son of Man person is coming to fulfill these. Now, it's not fulfilled in this passage we're looking at now, but just to give you a background for what we talked about in the book of Revelation there. So, why Son of Man instead of Son of God? When you have a specific title like this given concerning the Messiah, you need to recognize that it is this particular title for some reason. Jesus, in his ministry here on earth, had a number of titles: Messiah, Prince of Peace, Son of God, and other titles, and all those have their individual significance. They have the reason why there were so many. Jesus had so many titles. There's so many aspects and dimensions of the person of Jesus Christ, and so he has all these titles. So, what is the significance of the Son of Man title? You could well expect that here it would be Son of God, but it's significant that it's not. It's Son of Man. So let's look at this thing about Son of Man. This was Jesus' favorite title for himself. In fact, I don't think he very seldom, if ever, he referred to himself in his earthly ministry by any other title than this, Son of Man. So the reason for it being Son of Man rather than Son of God is because Jesus Christ is the representative of mankind. Jesus Christ is the one person of the Godhead who came to live here on earth to give himself as a sacrifice in order to restore to the human race what was given to it in the creation. So for this, let's look at Psalms chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. Chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. What is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crowned him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hand. You have put all things under his feet. Now, this passage is talking about a way back in the beginning of the creation. God created everything else, and then he created man. And all this passage is telling us is that God created man, and for one of the purposes was for him to be over all the rest of the creation, crowned him with glory and majesty, and for him to be over all of creation. So when it says, what is man that you take notice of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him, that's talking, both of those are talking about humanity. Man and the Son of Man is humanity. Now, so like I say, Jesus came to restore that to the human race. So now look with me, if you will, in that Hebrews passage, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through 9, and I'll get there eventually. Excuse me. I thought I had a marker in there to probably do this. Yeah, it's falling down. Okay, so Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through 9. For he did not subject angels to the world to come, concerning which we are speaking. Now, in this passage, the writer of Hebrews is talking about how Jesus is superior to the angels, and he's going to use this to make that particular point. For he did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which we are speaking, but one has testified where saying, and he's going to quote that passage in Psalms. But what is man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you are concerned about him? You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, and you appointed him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. Now, the writer of Hebrews is simply restating the fact that one of the reasons why God created man was for him to be in dominion over all the rest of the creation. And so he goes on here then in verse 8, and he says, for in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subjected to him. Everything in the creation subjected to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. Right now, because of the fall, all the rest of the creation certainly is not under the subjection of mankind. But verse 9, but we do see him, Jesus, who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. And so the implied meaning here of the writer of Hebrews is this dominion of man was lost because of the fall, but Jesus has come to restore that. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens by the time you get to the end of the book of Revelation. So this Son of Man title here, John saw the Son of Man. He could have said Jesus. He could have said Messiah. Could have said Son of God. A number of others, but he says Son of Man. He saw the Son of Man. Because Jesus is representative of mankind, he comes to restore all that was lost in the fall of man. Now we'll move on to Revelation chapter 1, verse 17 through 20, which is the last section of chapter 1. And let's read these verses here before we move into chapter 2. And reading Revelation 1, 17 through 20. When I saw him, that is, one like the Son of Man, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And he placed his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Therefore, write the things which you have seen, the things that which are, the things which will take place, and the things which will take place after these things. As for the mystery of the seven stars, which you saw in my hand, and the seven golden lampstands, the seven stars are the angels or the ministers. Angel is simply, the basic meaning of angel is messenger. So he's probably referring to the pastors here, I believe, of the seven churches, and seven lampstands are the seven churches. Reading through verse 7, verses 17 through 20. Notice John's response here. He was afraid. After reading this, I think again, what would my response be? I wonder what my response would be if suddenly in this room, what John was seeing about the Son of Man, he appeared in this room. I wonder what my response would be. I probably faint. I don't know, but maybe John did. Maybe fell down fainting. I don't know. He was afraid. He fell at the feet of Jesus. Notice Jesus' response to John. He says, "Do not be afraid." Jesus tells us to not be afraid. And what's really interesting and important here is even in the very presence of God, God invites us to not be afraid. And then he repeated the point that had been made previously in verse 8 about him being the first and the last. And then he adds, I have the keys of death and of Hades. So Jesus overcame death for us, and he has the keys to death and Hades so that we can have eternal life. How does Jesus describe the things that John is to write? And Jesus instructed John here, as we've seen in the verses. In this vision you're going to see, I want you to write that down, and I want you to send that to the seven churches of Asia. And then he gives a little statement about what John is overall, what John's going to be writing. So let's look at that. Answer: Jesus says to write the things which you have seen, past, things which are present, and things that will, future, take place. In other words, John, in the book of Revelation, we can expect to see John writing about things that he'd already seen before this time, things which are present at that time, and things that would be future from that time. Then Jesus identified the seven lampstands in verse 13 and the seven stars in verse 16. And as we have said, he identified that as the seven churches and their seven ministers. And Jesus is walking among them. He has the seven stars in his hand. So that means that he is directly involved in the work of the church. He has special relationship to the ministers, and he's walking. His presence is being in the churches. And if we are right, and I think we are, about these seven churches representing the entire church age, then Jesus is present with us throughout this entire church age. As he said, he'd never leave us nor forsake us. He's walking among the churches. So now we have completed our discussion of the first chapter of the book of Revelation, and we have come to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 3, where you have recorded the messages that seven messages that Jesus gave to John to give to these seven churches. Now, in an introduction thing here, I want to look at, because you notice that there are some common elements. There are some elements in that are common to all seven. Well, we're going to see an exception or two, but basically these are common elements. That is, elements that are in each and every one of these messages to the churches. Let's see what those are. Number one, the church that is to be addressed is identified. Number two, something special about the speaker. In other words, the Son of Man reveals something special about himself. And then he says, I know. Of course, Jesus is omniscient as God, but he's going to talk about, to every one of them, he's going to talk about something that he knows in particular about each and every one of them. And then he has an assessment, and it's nearly always a negative assessment of the church's condition and the verdict of that. And then, number 5, he has a correction, what they need to do, alert, warning, instructions for each and every one of these churches in view of their situation. Number 6, he gives them a general exhortation, and that general exhortation is, he that hath ear to hear, let him hear. And then he closes with a 7th thing, and that is promise to overcomers. So wouldn't you know, given all the 7s that we're having in the book of Revelation, there's 7 parts to each one of these messages. Fullness of message to the churches. So in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, let's read these verses. And this is the message to the church at Ephesus. To the angel of the church at Ephesus write, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this, I know your deeds and your toil, your perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. And you have persevered and have endured for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. But I have something against you, that you have left your first love. Therefore, remember from where you have fallen, and repent and do the deeds you did at first. Or else I am coming to you and will remove your lampstand out of its place, unless you repent. Yet this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So sure enough, we see every one of those 7 elements in this first message. And the first element is the name of the church, Ephesus, church at Ephesus. And the way that Jesus identifies himself here is a repeat, actually, of previous, and some of these are. He identifies himself as the one who holds the 7 stars and walks among the 7 lampstands. The third element, where he commends them, he says, you persevere and you cannot tolerate evil men. And so Jesus talks about them being able to stand against evil. But he says, I have somewhat against you. You've left your first love. Left your first love. So element number 5 is instruction, admonition, for them to return to the deeds that you did at first. That is, return to your first love and act accordingly. And then 6, he says, here's he who has an ear to hear, and then there's a message there. And finally, number 7, he tells them that to him who overcomes, in this particular case, the promise is to grant them to eat of the tree of life. Grant them to eat. So we see these 7 elements in this first message to the church at Ephesus. Now, that's the basic thing to Ephesus, but we need to go on here and look especially at Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, and flesh this out. He says, in commending them, he says that they hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, as I do hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans. Well, now, who are the Nicolaitans? In fact, it's rather hard to determine exactly what group Jesus is referring to here. But there's some ideas, and one is that this refers to Nicholas, who was one of the first deacons in Acts chapter 6 and verse 5. You remember where they were sharing their goods with everyone, having them in common and sharing with everyone, so everyone had some. And some of the Greeks said that their widows were not being served well, so the apostles appoint 7 deacons to look over this, to have charge of this, and one of them was Nicholas. Now, according to church history, he backslid and started a heresy in the latter part of the first century. And that heresy was that, and you even hear this taught today, that once you're born again, once you're saved, you're always saved. So from then on, it doesn't matter what you do, you can't lose your salvation. So just indulge yourself in unrestrained indulgence, free to indulge in any lust of the flesh you want to. And so Jesus commends them for being against that, and he likewise is against that. And this became a part of Gnosticism by the 2nd century. Now, the second church that a message is given to here is the message to Smyrna in chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna, the first and the last, listen for these 7 parts as we read through here. And to the angel of the church of Samaria, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this: I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. So this is a unique one, as we will see as we go through this. Okay, the first element is the church is identified, the message to the Smyrna. And then the speaker, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, identifies himself again as the first and the last, who was dead and now alive. And then he says, I know, I see, I know what's going on with you. Suffering tribulation, you're suffering poverty, and you're being blasphemed. You know, God, Jesus knows what's going on in our lives, and we can be thankful for that. And he recognizes what we're going through. And then, interestingly here, there's no condemnation. There's no negative analysis. He doesn't find anything to criticize them for. And there'll only be one other church that would be said about that. And so 5 out of the 7 all have some condemnation that he says to them, but not here in Smyrna. And then He says, do not fear the tribulation. He told them the tribulation was coming, but he says, don't be afraid, but rather be faithful unto death. So that's his instruction. Do not fear tribulation. See, there's no correction here because he didn't have anything to condemn them about. So his instruction here is to not fear tribulation and to be faithful unto death. Number 6, that line again, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says, to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And then he says the promise, the number 7, which is always the promise to overcomers. He says, to overcomers here, they will be given the crown of life, and therefore they will not suffer the second death. Now we're out of time for this session, but we'll next time we will move on to Revelation chapter 2, verse 12 through 17, and we'll look at the message to the church of Pergamon. It's a very interesting one, and so I hope you've enjoyed this session, and we will look forward to having you back with us as we continue. And so have a good day, have a good week, and God bless you.